The old homesteaders used to say a Minnesota winter could judge a man more harshly than any preacher or magistrate. Out here, cold wasn't just a season, it was a force, a presence, a quiet executioner that slipped through log seams and tested every flaw in a cabin, a fire, or a man's courage. In the winter of 1885, that presence grew teeth. The wind arrived, first a thin needling howl that swept across the prairie like a blade sharpened on ice. Then came the cold wave, a mass of Arctic air so dense and so unforgiving that it split wagon tongues and froze axe handles solid in the hands of the men who carried them. At night, the sky turned the color of iron. Breath crystallized before it could leave a man's beard. Even the wolves went silent. In the middle of this frozen wilderness stood a cabin that looked by all accounts pathetic. The walls were thin, barely thicker than fence rails. The logs were small. The entire structure looked like it had been built in a hurry by someone who didn't understand what lived inside a northern winter. Neighbors whispered that the man who built it was doomed. But when the cold hit, when the mercury fell past 40 degrees, then past 50 degrees, and finally plunged to a staggering 61 degrees, something happened that no one expected. Every thick-walled cabin struggled to stay above freezing. Fires roared day and night, wood piles vanished, families huddled in terror. Yet inside that flimsy cabin, a steady warmth held. Not comfort, but safety, survival. A full 29 degrees warmer than any house for miles around. And the man who built it, a quiet Swedish carpenter named Elias Holmbäck, was about to teach the entire frontier that survival isn't about strength. It's about understanding. Long before anyone mocked Elias Holmbeck's strange new cabin, the Minnesota Territory had already become a quiet graveyard for poorly built shelters and overconfident settlers. By the mid-1800s, waves of immigrants from Norway, Sweden, Germany, and Scotland poured into the northern frontier, drawn by cheap land and the promise of independence. But few understood that this land was ruled by a winter unlike any they had ever faced. Here, cold did not simply arrive. It conquered. Late autumn winds barreled down from the Canadian plains, flattening prairie grass and driving frost deep into the soil. Lakes froze in perfect sheets. Smoke rose straight into the sky, as if pinned by invisible nails. To survive this place required more than strength. It required wisdom, knowledge of insulation, airflow, moisture, and how wood behaved when the temperature dropped low enough to split fence posts in half. Yet most homesteaders followed a single, unwavering rule. Bigger logs mean better protection. To them, a cabin's worth was measured by mass-thick 16-inch walls, heavy timbers, and roofs so loaded with weight, they sagged under their own pride. The frontier valued brawn over brains. If something looked solid, it was assumed to be safe. But the truth was harsher. Every winter, settlers froze inside their own oversized fortresses. Thick logs sucked heat outward like a sponge draining warm water. Cabin interiors dropped below freezing, even with fires burning red hot. Ice formed on the inside of walls. Children slept with scarves over their noses to prevent frostbite while breathing. The prairie had a way of stripping illusions down to bone, and behind every failure was the same misconception: cold is an enemy you can muscle through. But winter does not care how thick your logs are. It cares how heat travels, how air moves, how moisture hides inside walls and turns to ice. This was the deeper truth Elias understood the moment he arrived, the truth the frontier had ignored for decades. Out here, survival wasn't about stacking more wood. It was about working with the physics of the land itself. Elias Holmbäck arrived in the Minnesota Territory with nothing that impressed the frontier eye. He wasn't a large man, nor loud, nor eager to boast about the winters he had survived overseas. He carried only a handmade chest of tools, a battered traveling coat lined with old reindeer hide, and the quiet gaze of someone who had spent too much of his life studying wind water and wood. He was 42 when he crossed the St. Croix that spring, older than most homesteaders just starting their claims. But age hadn't dulled him. If anything, it had sharpened him. Before America, Elias had lived along the Gulf of Bothnia in northern Sweden, a place where the sea froze in slabs, thick enough to support horses and entire fishing villages, vanished under storms that drove snow sideways like sand. Elias wasn't just a carpenter, he was a shipwright. For 15 winters, he had worked in a coastal yard where they built double-hulled boats to survive Baltic storms. He knew the smell of wet timber, the sound of a plank beginning to fail, the way a structure could be light, yet incredibly strong if its stresses were balanced correctly. He had seen ships sink because moisture collected where it shouldn't, creating frost rot that spread like a hidden infection. He understood insulation not as a material, but as a system. Airflow as a living thing. Condensation as an enemy more dangerous than cold. While other settlers learned by trial and error, Elias learned from the ocean. And the ocean did not forgive mistakes. Why come to America not for riches, not for adventure? His wife had died 2 winters before, taken by an illness the village doctor couldn't name. Grief has a way of loosening a man's roots. When the Homestead Act offered a new beginning, Elias accepted. He sought land where the silence was wide enough to swallow memory. He chose Minnesota deliberately. Its cold reminded him of home. Its challenges felt familiar. And deep inside, he believed he could build something better, something the frontier had not seen. But the men who watched him work would soon laugh at every idea he carried across the Atlantic. The first thing Elias did when he arrived on his claim was study the cabins around him. Most settlers copied the same pattern: massive pine logs stacked like fortress walls, chinked with clay, and straw sealed again with frozen mud as winter approached. These homes looked impressive broad-shouldered silhouettes against the prairie, thick enough to stop an arrow, heavy enough to shake the ground when a log dropped into place. But to Elias, they looked wrong. He walked from homestead to homestead that spring, running calloused fingers along the cold surfaces of the log walls, studying the shrinkage gaps, the splayed checks, the places where moisture collected. Settlers were proud to show off their handiwork. They talked about how many men it took to raise each log, how long it would last, how solid it felt when struck with a fist. Elias didn't see strength. He saw failure waiting to happen. The problem, as he understood it, wasn't the craftsmanship. Many frontier builders were skilled. The problem was the physics they were fighting against. Thick logs absorbed heat like a sponge absorbs water. At night, even with a fire blazing, the temperature inside those cabins often dropped faster than outside. Elias knew why wood, especially green wood, conducted heat steadily and stubbornly. A 16-inch log wall didn't block cold, it helped pull warmth outward until every room felt like a meat locker. The settlers had unintentionally built giant thermal bridges. He also noticed the seams. No matter how well chinked, thick log walls shifted as the wood dried. Tiny pathways formed for air to slip through. Even a half-inch draft was enough to drain a stove of its work. Many cabins had a mysterious whistling sound during storms, air being sucked through microscopic channels like a flute in a gale. To the homesteaders, this was just the way cabins behaved. To Elias, it was the sound of heat escaping. He understood something the frontier didn't. A thick wall is not an insulated wall. Mass was not protection. Weight was not warmth. What mattered was how the wall handled heat, how it slowed conduction, blocked drafts, and controlled moisture. The frontier thought strength came from size. Elias believed strength came from design, and for that belief, he was about to be ridiculed. The trouble began the moment Elias unrolled his hand-drawn plans on a rough-hewn table at the local trading post. A few curious homesteaders leaned over, expecting to see the familiar, thick-walled frontier blueprint. Instead, they stared at something that looked, at least to them, like the sketch of a children's playhouse. Two thin walls, a hollow space between them, and logs no bigger than a man's wrist. The laughter started before anyone asked a question. "You planning to house chickens or people in that thing? Looks like a fence post shack. Those walls will blow over in the first storm." Elias didn't argue. He simply explained calmly that the gap between the two walls acted as a thermal break, the most important element of cold weather design. He spoke of trapped air, moisture pathways, and insulation pockets, concepts as foreign to the frontier mind as steam engines to a horse. One homesteader, a broad-shouldered Irishman, snorted. "This ain't the Baltic, friend. Minnesota winters are real." A few others nodded vigorously. But the fiercest critic was Jonas Burke, a man who had weathered 8 winters and believed that made him an expert. He jabbed a thick finger at Elias's drawing. "Thin walls leak heat. Thick walls keep it in. Everyone knows that. You build this Swedish contraption, and you'll be asking for shelter before Christmas." Elias simply folded the plans and said, "Nature will tell us who is right." There was one voice, however, not mocking Clara Hensley, a young widow raising 2 children alone. She didn't understand the science, but she recognized careful thinking when she saw it. Pulling Elias aside, she whispered, "I hope it works. The winters aren't kind to people who stand alone." Even she, though, couldn't shake the worry in her eyes. Throughout that summer, as Elias began building, groups of settlers made their way to his clearing just to scoff at the sight. 2 narrow walls rising from the foundation, each made of small, uniform logs that looked more like boat timbers than cabin stock. The space between them, 7 inches wide, was the main joke. A wall with a hole in it, they jeered. But Elias kept working with near-sacred precision, smoothing joints, sealing seams, preparing a structure the frontier wasn't ready to believe in. The mockery was loud, but winter would be louder. Elias began construction in late May, when the ground was soft enough to work and the air carried the green smell of thawed earth. While other homesteaders spent their days wrestling massive pine logs into place, Elias selected smaller timber, straight uniform, 4 to 5 inches in diameter. These logs dried faster, warped less, and locked together cleanly, but to the casual eye, they looked pitiful. Men passing by shook their heads. "You building a cradle or a cabin? Looks like you're preparing to freeze politely." But Elias ignored them. Each log was hand-shaped with a shipwright's precision. He prepared the notches the way he once prepared hull ribs, angled to distribute stress, fitted with tight joints that needed no heroic chinking to compensate for sloppy work. He built the inner wall first, rising it log by log until it reached shoulder height. Every seam received a thin layer of resin and fiber, a trick he learned while waterproofing boats. Then he stepped back and began the second wall, 7 inches outside the first, perfectly parallel, perfectly spaced. This 7-inch cavity was the heart of his design. Not empty space, not wasted space, but a sanctuary for trapped air. During summer, Elias gathered reeds from marsh edges, shredded birch bark into fine curls, and hauled sawdust from a mill 10 miles away. He spread the materials to dry beneath the sun, turning them each day until they crackled between his fingers. When the mixture was light, fluffy, and bone dry, he packed it carefully, but not tightly, into the cavity between the 2 walls. He knew if he compressed it, airflow would increase and the insulation would fail. He knew if he packed it loosely, settling would create cold pockets. So he filled the cavity in layers, tapping each section into place with the gentleness of a man tucking a child into bed. By August, the wall stood complete, slender, elegant, and to neighbors utterly ridiculous. One old-timer scratched his beard and muttered, "Looks like a single hard shove could knock the whole thing over." But Elias saw something different. He saw a structure that breathed, resisted moisture, and understood heat the way he did. He saw a cabin built not of brute force, but of knowledge. By the time autumn settled over the prairie, Elias's cabin was finished, light, narrow-walled, and unlike anything Minnesota had seen. The neighbors waited for the first cold snap, with the same curiosity they might reserve for a circus performance. They didn't want Elias to freeze, but they were certain he would. The first test came quietly in early November. A mild, cold front pushed temperatures down to 10 degrees Celsius overnight. Frost rimed the grass, and the pond stilled beneath a thin sheet of ice. The community woke to chimney smoke, billowing from every homestead, everyone except Elias. His chimney barely puffed. Robert Jonas Burke rode past on horseback, squinting at the stillness of Elias's stovepipe. "Fool probably ran out of firewood already," he muttered. Thin walls eat heat like wolves eat sheep. But inside the cabin, a different story unfolded. Elias had lit only a modest morning fire. 4 split logs enough to warm the stove and push the chill from the air. As the flames settled into steady coals, he fetched a small mercury thermometer from his chest of tools. It was old, inherited from his father, the glass cloudy from decades of hard winters. He placed it in 3 spots inside the cabin near the stove, against the inner wall, and finally on the floor near the door. Hours later, with the fire nearly out, he checked. 64 drum. Almost perfectly even throughout the room. The air felt still, no drafts, no cold rivers sliding down the walls, no icy corners where breath turned white. The inner logs were faintly warm to the touch, not cold or sweating with condensation. The insulation cavity was working exactly as he intended, a thermal break halting conduction, a trapped air barrier stopping heat in its tracks. Outside, neighbors struggled. Their big walled cabins required constant feeding. They used twice the wood Elias burned just to stay comfortable. A few homesteaders approached his door that evening, curious and concerned. Elias answered wearing only a shirt sleeves rolled, as if it were late September rather than early winter. "What kind of trick are you playing in here?" one man asked. "No trick," Elias replied softly, "only design." Word of Elias's strangely warm cabin spread faster than the frost, creeping across the prairie. By mid-December, the curiosity turned into open suspicion. Men gathered at the county trading post, half general store, half gossip hall, to discuss how a thin-walled structure could stay warm while their heavy log fortresses bled heat like cracked barrels. When Elias stepped inside one afternoon to buy lamp oil, every conversation in the room quieted. Then Jonas Burke, broad-loud and proud of his 8 winters, slapped his mitten on the counter and barked, "Tell us, Swede. What sorcery are you hiding in that toy house of yours?" The crowd chuckled, but their eyes were sharp. They wanted an answer. Elias simply unbuttoned his coat and set 2 wooden boards on the table, 1 thick slab of pine, 1 thin plank spaced above a pocket of air. Heat travels, he began calmly, much like water through soil. He placed a hot iron tool against the thick slab. Within seconds, the warmth seeped through to the other side. The men touched it, surprised at how quickly it heated. Then he pressed the iron to the thin plank. Beneath it, the air pocket remained cool. Jonas scowled. "That's a parlor trick." "No trick," Elias replied. "Air that cannot move becomes a shield. Wood alone cannot stop cold. But wood and trapped air together can." Some of the men looked thoughtful. Others crossed their arms. Burke scoffed loudly. "This is Minnesota, not Stockholm. Our winters don't care about your fancy ideas." 1 or 2 nodded in agreement. The frontier believed in muscle, not mechanics. Only one voice broke the tension: Clara Hensley, who had been quietly picking up flour and salt at the back of the store. "If the man has warmth, while the rest of us are burning through next year's wood," she said softly, "maybe we should listen instead of laugh." A long silence followed. But doubt dies harder than cold. By the time Elias left the trading post, he could feel a dozen skeptical eyes on his back. His experiment had made them curious, yes, but curiosity on the frontier is often tangled with resentment. Winter would decide the argument soon enough. The first real blow of a winter arrived like a living thing, an invisible beast crawling down from the Canadian plains. On the morning of February 3rd, the wind shifted. It carried a sharpness that settled into bone, a metallic scent that old settlers recognized instantly. "Something's coming," one farmer whispered. He was right. By sundown, the temperature had fallen past 20 degrees abreast. Chickens froze in their coops. The water pails inside cabins stiffened with a thin layer of ice. Horses refused to leave their lean-tos, sensing danger humans couldn't yet see. Then, in the small hours of February 5th, the cold wave struck with its full brutal force. A mass of Arctic air, dense as iron and older than memory, dropped across the frontier like a hammer. The mercury fell past 40 dig then 50 dig faster than families could feed their stoves. At 55-degree, wind bit through wool coats as if they were paper. At 60-degree, fires struggled to draw air, their flames shrinking and trembling like frightened animals. Cabins groaned under the sudden temperature drop. Thick logs cracked with gunshot sounds. Frost crawled across interior walls in feathery white patterns. In some homes, water inside buckets froze solid while sitting 3 feet from the firebox. Mothers wrapped their children in every quilt they owned. Men worked stoves until their hands blistered. Inside Jonas Burke's cabin, smoke poured backward into the room, pushed down the chimney by swirling pressure outside. "We can't keep up," he shouted, throwing another armload of wood onto an already roaring fire. Across the prairie, another family burned their table, and then their chairs, then the treads of their staircase, anything that would burn. A widow named Margaret Tully stuffed her windows with spare clothing, but the drafts still slithered through, icy and merciless. By midnight, temperatures reached 61 degrees, the coldest ever recorded in the region. Outside, the world fell silent. Not peaceful dead. Even the wolves refused to howl. The frontier had met winters before. Hard winters, bitter ones. But nothing like this. This was the kind of cold that stripped away illusions, punished mistakes, and revealed exactly which structures and which men were built to survive. While the prairie groaned and split under the unimaginable cold, Elias Holmbäck moved through his cabin with the calm, deliberate motions of a man who understood exactly what was happening beyond his walls. Every few hours he checked the stove, added a modest stick or two of split birch, then opened his notebook to record temperatures. He did not panic. He did not rush. He trusted the design. At 61 Bundegeiksdorf, the outer wall boards contracted with a faint, brittle creak. Most cabins would respond with interior frost or dripping condensation, but not this one. Elias placed his hand flat on the inner wall. It was lukewarm, almost gentle, as if the cabin itself breathed warmth. Next, he checked the thermometer pinned near the door, 52 degrees. Not comfortable, not cozy, but safe, survivable. A miracle by frontier standards. More important than the number was the evenness. The air held steady, no swirling drafts, no icy corners, no sudden temperature drops near the floor. His double wall system had done its work perfectly, and the inner log layer resisted conduction. In the 7-inch insulation cavity trapped a dead zone of air, and the outer logs shed the cold without letting it penetrate. Outside wind clawed at the cabin like an animal. Snow blasted horizontally, piling against the outer wall in high ridges. But the structure did not shudder or bend. Elias had tied the two walls together with cross braces, spaced at intervals light, but incredibly strong. The building behaved like a ship in a storm, flexible where it needed to be, rigid where it mattered. Every hour he made rounds. Checked for condensation, none. Checked for frost buildup, none. Checked for drafts. With a candle flame, the flame didn't flicker. Where other cabins groaned in pain, his stood quiet, almost serene. He added a single log to the stove. Its soft crackle seemed out of place, while the world outside screamed like broken glass. Elsewhere on the prairie, men were feeding fires with frantic handfuls of wood. Some burned a month's supply in a single night. Elias burned barely a quarter of that because he wasn't fighting the cold. His cabin was. When dawn finally bled into the sky on February 8th, it did so weakly, as if even the sun was reluctant to step out into a world still locked at 25 degrees. Smoke rose from nearly every homestead in frantic, twisting columns. Families were exhausted, coughing from a full night of choking stove smoke. Some men had slept sitting upright just to keep feeding the fire. Others hadn't slept at all. But at the edge of the clearing, Elias Holmbäck's chimney stood almost still. Again, Jonas Burke trudged through the snow toward the flimsy cabin, his beard frozen stiff as boots, giving sharp cracking noises with each step. He wasn't alone. 2 other settlers followed him, not out of mockery now, but dread. They had all seen cabins fail during cold snaps, far less severe than last night's. A structure built with thumb-sized logs and a 7-inch air gap impossible. Surely the man was frozen in his bed. Jonas hesitated before knocking. He exchanged a grim look with the others. Then the door opened. Elias stood there in his shirt sleeves, hair slightly tousled from sleep cheeks, pink, not frostbitten, and a steaming tin cup in his hand. Behind him, the interior glowed with the soft amber of a fire, burning low and steady. The air inside spilled outward in a warm gust. Jonas blinked, stunned. "Holmbäck, you're alive." "Of course," Elias said, as though the question were absurd. Jonas stepped inside, breath-catching as he felt the warmth. He walked to the wall, pressed his palm against the logs. They were warm. Not cold, not sweating with frost, warm. "This makes no sense," Jonas muttered. "My walls are 3 times as thick." And I could see my own breath indoors. Elias nodded gently. "Thickness is not the shield. Insulation is the shield. Your wall is 1 barrier. Mine is 3. Another settler. Almost Sutter." Thomas Briggs stared around the room in disbelief. "How are you burning so little wood?" "My family nearly emptied our entire pile." "Because," Elias replied quietly, "my cabin does not fight the cold. It resists it." Outside, the prairie still trembled under deadly cold. Inside, knowledge had kept a man alive, while others barely clung to survival. Once the worst of the cold wave passed, the prairie felt like a battlefield after a siege. Smoke-blackened snow piles leaned against cabins. Wood piles stood half their former size. Families moved stiffly, exhausted from nights spent feeding ferocious fires that barely kept them above freezing. A few homes sat dark and silent. Theirs had lost the fight. But one cabin stood nearly unchanged. Elias's woodpile looked almost untouched. His roof showed no signs of frost rot. His walls bore no internal ice stains. And soon word spread through every trail trading route and church pew the Swede's cabin stayed warm. What had been mockery turned to humility almost overnight. The first to ask for help was Thomas Briggs, a young father whose children had woken crying from cold burns along their cheeks. He approached Elias with a battered hat in hand. "I don't need a miracle. Just enough warmth for my kids," he said. Elias nodded and walked with him to his cabin. There he examined the shrinking gaps and the draft lines, the cold corners beneath windows. He explained the flaws with patience, never with scorn. Then he drew a simple diagram, an inner wall, an outer wall, and a narrow cavity between them, filled with trapped, motionless air. "It is not magic," he said, "only understanding." Soon others came, farmers, widows, stubborn old men who once mocked him. They asked how to retrofit what they already had. Elias showed them 3 levels of improvement. Level 1, stuff existing gaps with dry reed sawdust or wool. Level 2, add an interior false wall to create a shallow insulation cavity. Level 3. Build a full double wall extension tied together like the hull of a boat. Even small improvements worked. Drafts slowed. Firewood lasted longer. The cabins breathed more evenly. People slept through the night without waking to shivering children or ice forming inside their wash basins. Elias never charged a penny. He believed knowledge, true knowledge, didn't belong to one man. On the frontier, knowledge was survival, and survival was something neighbors owed each other. By late winter, the settlement looked different. Cabins were being rebuilt. Extensions went up. Insulation hung drying outside homes like strange banners of hope. The same men who once laughed at Elias now followed his pencil lines with reverence. Winter had humbled them. Elias simply guided them toward warmth. As winter reluctantly loosened its grip on the frontier, the community began looking beyond personal survival. Families weren't just rebuilding their homes, they were rebuilding their confidence. And soon attention turned to the buildings that served everyone. The church, the one-room schoolhouse, and the small supply depot that stored precious goods through the winter. These structures had suffered brutally during the cold wave. The church, a modest timber building used for Sunday gatherings, had been so cold that the congregation had to stand during services just to keep blood moving through their legs. Frost clung to the pulpit like lace. Even the hymn books curled from moisture. The schoolhouse had been worse. Children huddled in their coats, ink froze in the wells, and lessons were cut short because the stove could not keep up. Parents talked quietly about whether their children should even attend during deep winter. And the depot, where root vegetables, grain sacks, and winter supplies were kept, had seen half its stored potatoes turn to stone in the cold. So the elders asked Elias, "Can your method save these places too?" Elias walked through each building, quietly feeling the walls with the back of his hand, checking corners for drafts, and tapping timbers to listen for hollow pockets where cold gathered. Then he nodded. Yes, but each building needs its own design. For the church, he recommended an 8-inch cavity filled with dry sawdust, easier to maintain and perfect for large walls that didn't flex much. Volunteers from the entire settlement worked side by side, layering insulation and sealing gaps with woven grass and clay. The next Sunday, the congregation wept not from cold, but from the warmth that greeted them. A small stove now heated the entire room. The schoolhouse received a double wall makeover with dried reeds and birch shavings. Children returned without numb fingers or blue lips. Teachers no longer kept extra blankets by the door. And the depot Elias built a partial double wall enclosure around the northern face, the side that took the worst of the wind. For the first time in years, the winter stores survived intact. Soon, travelers passing through the settlement whispered, "The warm buildings, those are the Swedes' design." Knowledge had reshaped not just homes, but the heart of the community. Long after the worst of the winter had passed, curiosity replaced fear. Settlers who once mocked Elias now gathered around his workbench, eager to understand what had saved his life and nearly theirs. Elias, ever patient, laid out his drawings and small wooden models. But this time, instead of laughter, he heard a rare sound on the frontier quiet attention. He began with the simplest truth. Heat has 3 enemies: conduction, convection, and radiation. You must defeat all 3. To the frontier mind, these words sounded almost scholarly. Yet Elias explained them with the same clarity he once used to train young ship carpenters. Conduction, he said, was the thief that stole warmth through solid materials. A 16-inch log wall looked mighty, but wood carried heat like a rope pulling water from a well. Thick walls simply gave heat a longer road to travel, nothing more. In Elias's design, heat faced a gauntlet, a 4-inch inner wall, a 7-inch dead air cavity, and a 4-inch outer wall. 3 barriers, 3 chances to slow escape. Convection was the second enemy, the invisible river of air moving through cracks and gaps. Traditional cabins were full of drafts, even when chinked well. When air moves, it carries heat with it, sucking a cabin dry no matter how large the fire. But Elias's double wall system stopped air from moving at all. The insulation reed fluff sawdust birch curls created tiny chambers where air sat trapped motionless. Still air is one of nature's best insulators. Radiation came last, the infrared glow that warm surfaces emit to colder ones. It was the reason a man standing near a frozen window could feel cold on his skin, even if the room was warm. Elias countered this by separating the surfaces. The inner wall radiated heat, yes, but much of it was absorbed or slowed before it ever reached the outer logs. The outer wall radiated into the cold, but it received so little heat that its loss hardly mattered. When the settlers asked why his cabin stayed warm with so little wood, Elias smiled. "Because my walls do not fight the cold," he said. "They deny it." Then he revealed the final triumph. Modern builders would later call his design an R24 to R27 wall, as efficient as many homes built a century later. On the frontier, with nothing but hand tools and common materials, Elias had matched the science of the future. When the snow finally began to recede and the rivers cracked open under the first warmth of spring, and the settlement looked different, not because the world had changed, but because the people in it had. Winter is a teacher with a cruel hand, and that year it carved a lesson into every man, woman, and child who survived it. The frontier had always valued strength, thick logs, big fires, large men with larger axes. But the cold wave of '85 revealed a truth most had never considered. Survival isn't a contest of force. It's a conversation with nature. Elias understood that long before he set foot in America. To him, winter was not an enemy to be beaten into submission. It was a set of principles, laws of heat and air and moisture that a wise man could respect, predict, and work alongside. Most settlers had treated winter like a brute. Elias treated it like a craftsman treats the grain of wood, something to read, not resist. The homesteaders, humbled by the cold, began to see the deeper meaning behind his design. Thick walls had fooled them because they looked strong. The same way a man with broad shoulders could appear capable yet freeze in his ignorance. The same way a small-looking idea could carry a whole community through a storm. Appearance had misled them. Reality had corrected them. Around the settlement fires, men spoke softly of how they had mocked Elias, how pride had kept them from listening, how half the suffering that winter brought might have been avoided if someone had asked why instead of laughing. Even Jonas Burke, once the loudest skeptic, admitted to his wife one night, "Maybe the winters we fear aren't the ones outside, but the ones we create by refusing to learn." The frontier had been built by hard work, yes, but it endured because of insight, small discoveries that protected families more than strength ever could. In that truth, the settlers found something deeper than warmth, a respect for knowledge, and a humility that winter had demanded from them all. By the late 1880s, Elias Holmbäck's cabin had become something of a quiet landmark, an odd-looking structure tucked at the edge of the clearing, its double walls weathered to a silver gray that blended seamlessly with the prairie sky. There was nothing outwardly grand about it. It didn't tower, didn't gleam, didn't announce itself as a triumph of engineering. But everyone in the settlement knew that cabin had beaten the cold wave of '85. In the years that followed, the community slowly reshaped itself around Elias's principles. New cabins rose with air cavities, and light logs arranged the way he taught. Children grew up learning the Holmbäck method, tracing small diagrams on slates in school. Hunters built winter shelters using reeds and sawdust tucked between bark panels. Even the trading post added an insulated rear storeroom to keep flour from freezing in deep winter. Elias never sought recognition. He was content repairing tools, helping neighbors, and tending a small garden of cold, hardy vegetables behind his home. Yet the settlement shifted around him the way trees shift over time toward sunlight. But nothing lasts forever, not even the houses that survive a legendary winter. When the 1930s arrived, a new family purchased the land. The Holmbäck cabin, 50 years old and still surprisingly solid, was dismantled to make room for a larger farmhouse. As the workers removed the inner wall, they paused, marveling at the insulation still dry and fluffy as the day it was packed. The logs, though thin, had hardly warped. No mold, no rot. Every joint told a story of intentional design. A local historian salvaged a section of the double wall and brought it to St. Paul, where it later became part of a small museum exhibit labeled Pioneering Thermal Construction, 1884-1885. Visitors rarely knew the full story, just that some Swedish shipwright had built a strange cabin that outperformed all others. But for the descendants of those who survived that brutal winter, the legacy ran deeper. Elias had shown that true strength didn't come from size or appearance. It came from understanding, from respecting nature, rather than trying to overpower it. His cabin was gone, but the lesson it taught would outlast every log. Long after Elias Holmbeck's cabin was taken down, long after the men who mocked him were dust, long after the severe winters of the 19th century became words in history books, the lesson of that strange, double-walled home still lingers across the northern frontier. Because this story was never just about lumber insulation or clever engineering. It was about something older. Something the frontier forced people to learn if they hoped to survive. Winter doesn't reward strength. It rewards understanding. Every generation of homesteaders had believed the same thing. Build bigger, build, heavier build, thicker, and you'll be safe. But the cold wave of '85 exposed that myth with a cruelty only nature can deliver. Massive cabins shook and cracked. Fires roared until chimneys glowed red, yet still families huddled in fear. Strength, the kind you can see, failed them. Elias's cabin didn't survive because it looked strong. It survived because it was strong in the ways that mattered: quietly, intelligently, invisibly. A wall no thicker than a man's hand defeated cold that split wagon tongues. A cavity filled with reeds and sawdust outperformed a mountain of solid timber. Knowledge, simple, humble knowledge, saved lives when muscle and tradition could not. That truth echoes far beyond the Minnesota prairie. We live in a world that still celebrates bulk over balance, noise over wisdom, and appearance over performance. We still judge ideas by how they look, rather than what they can do. We still dismiss the quiet craftsman, the thinker, the outsider, until the storm arrives and we suddenly realize how much we need them. Elias Holmbäck never asked to be a teacher, but winter made him one. And if there's something to take from this story, something that lasts longer than logs or snowpack, it's this: build for reality, not approval. Trust principles, not impressions. And when the world laughs at the thin walls you're building, keep building anyway. Because someday, when the temperature drops and the wind howls and the old rules fail, those thin walls might be the only thing standing between you and the cold.